Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to break down what some of the big issues are right now for the Wolves. We'll take stock of them here now that we're 14 games into the season, leading into a difficult road stretch for Minnesota. We'll also talk about specifically the non-Rudy Gobert minutes from a defensive perspective where the Wolves have really struggled this year. And we'll talk Wolves-Raptors tonight, the first Wolves game in 4 days. Ready to go for this one. It's all coming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Thursday, everybody. Happy Wolves game day. It's been since Sunday since we've had a Wolves game. Still riding high off the Julius Randle buzzer beater. That was the last Wolves game we've had. Ready for another one here tonight. Wolves-Raptors from Toronto. A good chance for the Wolves to continue their currently 2-game winning streak. Continue some good vibes going into a really tough game on Sunday against the Celtics. Lots to get to here today. I really want to talk about some of the stuff we touched on the other day on the show, related to the some of the struggles the Wolves have had here lately, specifically defensively with no Rudy Gobert. They got into it a bit on the Minnesota basketball party on yesterday's on Wednesday here in the Locked On Wolves feed. So I want to dig into a bit of that. And there's also some ESPN pieces this week about checking in on various West contenders and I guess East contenders as well, and some of their potential issues coming into the season and where they stand now. So I want to look at what ESPN was saying about the Wolves. We'll talk a bit about that. Then we'll get into Wolves-Raptors tonight too. So all that's on the show here today. A big thank you off the top as well for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show's free and available everywhere. That includes the YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. A reminder, you can sign up for the daily newsletter at LockedOnDaily.com. It's one stop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Just sign up for Locked On Wolves newsletter on LockedOnDaily.com right now. All right, so quick apologies. There was not a show yesterday, not the normal daily show. I'm clearly, you could probably still hear my voice, a bit under the weather. Was so bad yesterday I couldn't say more than a couple sentences without a coughing fit. So figured it was not likely I was going to be able to get a whole show put together. So we had the Minnesota basketball party that went on the feed Wednesday morning. So hopefully you check that out with all the guys that do a great job on that show, with Sam and Jack and Reggie and Ron. And then I'm back here today. We'll be back tomorrow after Wolves-Raptors. So should be back in the flow. But apologies if there's any weird things happening with my voice or weird edits for coughing here today. All right, let's go ahead and get into some of the aforementioned ESPN articles that mention the Timberwolves and the some of the questions surrounding the Wolves this year. So, like for instance, there is an article at ESPN right now called NBA Contender Questions: What's at Stake for the Celtics, Cavs, and More. So it's basically like, I think they picked like 6 contenders from each conference and then talked about, what's the issue right now, what's not going right or what is going right, what needs to stay going well for the teams like the Celtics and the Cavs and teams like the Wolves and the Mavericks, and what do they need to do differently, right? Because the Mavericks are I think 500 right now too. I shouldn't say 2. The Wolves are 8-6. Anyway, so the question here is, what's the biggest issue the Wolves need to address before they fall too far? And Kevin Pelton did this right up. He says the Wolves have slipped more at the defensive end than on offense after swapping Towns for Randle and DiVincenzo, but the slow start for Mike Conley still feels like their biggest concern. He says Conley was a crucial part of last year's Western Conference Finals run, posting the highest true shooting percentage of his 18-year NBA career. It slipped all the way to a career low over the first month of this season. Conley's made just 34% of his threes, and more worrisome, his points in the paint have dropped from 2.6 per game to just 1.2. Obviously, sidebar here, if you've watched Mike Conley play this year, he's not taking the ball to the basket. He's not shooting his patented floater. He, not that he was getting to the rim all that often, last season or the season before, but he was getting into the paint and shooting the floater. the floater that looks like it's a lob to Rudy. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's a true floater and he's trying to score. Occasionally he'd get all the way to his left, get to the rim, and score on a layup. But we didn't see that a ton last year. He's doing it even less this year. Okay. Back to Pelton. Pelton says, with little quality perimeter depth outside Chris Finch's tight 8-man rotation, more on that in a minute, things got even worse when Conley sat out last Wednesday in Portland to rest. Minnesota mustered just 98 points in a loss. The Timberwolves need Conley producing at a high level to contend. Okay, couple thoughts on that. One, I think he's right to an extent. There's a reason the Wolves extended Mike Conley last year. They gave a 36-year-old point guard a 2-year extension because they realized they need him to function at a high level in order for their offense to function at a high level. We saw that last year. Remember when he sat out in the playoffs? I think he missed 2 games in the playoffs. One game, they looked like they really needed him. Then the other game, they didn't. And there was something, I think, toward the end of last year in the regular season where Conley sat out for a bit too, and the offense really sputtered without him. I think, to me, it's like, if you don't watch the Wolves every night, I could see that the talking head thing on TV being like the national perspective, like, oh, they need their floor general, they need somebody to organize the offense. In doses, that's true. When Anthony Edwards and others kind of get out over their skis, and like, that's maybe not the right analogy. When things start moving too fast or they're a bit too frenetic and you need somebody like a Mike Conley to calm it down, that occasionally is true. But I don't think Mike Conley does a fair amount of organizing, but I don't think it's as much his organizing over the course of an entire game, night in and night out, that is actually what is that important to the Timberwolves offense. What I think is most important is having another plus 3-point shooter on the floor. Is having another true, Conley was one of the best 5 3-point shooters in the league the last 3 years. Full stop. A lot of people don't realize that, but having another 42+% 3-point shooter on the floor is a massive deal. And if now he's just a 33-34% below league average 3-point shooter, that's a big difference. That's like going from, it's like going from Mike Conley to Jordan McLaughlin on the perimeter, right? I know J-Mac shot better than that last year from 3, but like, if you don't have the gravity of another 40+% 3-point shooter, and you have Jaden McDaniels out there, and you have Rudy Gobert, now what's your spacing? It's what? It's just Ant and Julius Randle, who, is shooting it well this year, but he's more of a volume 3-point shooter. So now Ant's your only plus 3-point shooter in your starting lineup. For a team that shoots this many threes, that gets a bit dicey. So I think it's just as much the gravity of Conley as a shooter. And yes, the threat of him scoring in the paint, the threat of him scoring in a lob, that's just as important as like the floor general side of things, or, the actual Conley scoring points thing. It's the threat of Conley. And if teams start to believe that Conley doesn't want to or can't shoot threes, or doesn't want to or can't put the ball on the floor at all, then teams will be more willing to leave him and load up on Anthony Edwards, or, load up on Ant and prepare for the Rudy lob from Ant, and they completely ignore Jaden McDaniels. And obviously then Julius Randle's got to go to work. We talked about that the other day, is just how important Julius Randle is as a secondary scorer to this offense. And that was underscored on Sunday when he had to go to work for them to beat Phoenix. And again, where Ant only had 4 points in the first half, and we saw both Sacramento and Phoenix last weekend load up on Anthony Edwards. So they relied on Julius Randle. And if Mike Conley is going to be ineffective, then that underscores even more the importance of Julius Randle as a secondary scorer for the Wolves. Next, I want to talk about another ESPN article where it talks about a bit about the Timberwolves' improved depth because of their trade, and it references the Conley situation / DiVincenzo as well. So I want to get into that next, and then I want to talk a bit more about the non-Rudy defensive minutes before we get into the Wolves-Raptors matchup. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at Game Time. Game Time is the best place to find tickets to live events, not just sports either, but really any sort of live event you like to go to. Plus, they have a new feature right now called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Game Time Picks, they use Game Time Picks to curate the selections for you to make it even easier to save on your favorite events. There's tons of sports going on right now. It's a great time of year for sports. College sports, both football and basketball, of course, NBA basketball, you got NHL happening, NFL. Plus, you can also get concert tickets, comedy shows, theater, and they have all-in pricing. If you toggle on the all-in pricing feature, you can see your total up front with no surprise fees when you check out. And with their seat views, get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. And their lowest price guarantee means that if you think you find a better price somewhere else, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. That's LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. All right. Let's go ahead and dive in on the other ESPN article that I read over the last few days here. This is a bit more of a crowdsourced ESPN article. Actually, I take that back. This one is also Kevin Pelton. I guess the other one was a crowdsourced one, but Pelton wrote the Wolves part. So this article is called Grading Early Season Priorities and Plans for 10 Key NBA Teams. Okay, so like for these are basically the things that Kevin Pelton thought were important for these teams and what they look for so far this year. So like the Cavs was getting the big four to work together. They've gotten an A so far. The Mavs was perimeter defense by committee. That's an A-. Denver replacing KCP. That's a B-, and so on and so forth. Oh, interestingly enough, the Warriors, for the Warriors, it says playing a 12-man rotation. And they've done exactly that. They've used at least 11 players in every game this season, which is crazy. The exact opposite of the Wolves, who have played just 8 in some games, most games 9, and almost never is the 9th guy playing more than 5 minutes. Crazy. Anyway, for the Wolves, Pelton's thing for the Wolves was improved depth with trade. And he goes on to talk about his initial concern for the Wolves was related to perimeter depth, a need that he felt would be addressed by adding Donte DiVincenzo. And then he says, because the Wolves rotation has been almost entirely healthy, we've seen fewer than 100 combined minutes from rookies Rob Dillingham, Terrence Shannon Jr., and then also veteran Joe Ingles. When Dillingham was forced in the rotation with Conley sidelined last Wednesday, the early returns weren't great. Dillingham had 3 turnovers in 9 minutes. The Wolves were outscored by 13 in those 9 minutes in their loss to the Blazers. He goes on to say DiVincenzo is yet to shoot the ball as expected, making just 32% of his three-point attempts after shooting over 40% the previous 2 seasons with the Knicks and Warriors. And then he says, yet the Wolves bench overall has been a strength. It's their starting 5, which is outscoring opponents by just 3.7 points per 100 possessions, with Conley scoring far less efficiently, has struggled. Okay, so a couple things here. Obviously, the Wolves' perimeter depth is much improved with Donte DiVincenzo versus not having Donte DiVincenzo. The problem, which I'll get to in a minute here, that relates to the bench and comparing to last year's team, is that their bench size has shrunk. Their overall size has shrunk, obviously, with trading Karl-Anthony Towns, but that has impacted the Wolves. And their true point guard depth has also been impacted, which affects their point of attack defense. Okay, so he doesn't really get into this about how the overall improved depth is better, but they went from using a 9-man rotation last year to now using an 8-man rotation. No Kyle Anderson, no Karl-Anthony Towns. Those are obviously the 2 big ones. And what does that mean? Well, you bring in Julius Randle, you bring in Donte DiVincenzo, but now you've effectively just replaced the Kyle Anderson minutes with Donte DiVincenzo, which makes your bench unit smaller. And that 9th role last year was some combination, rotating cast of characters of Jordan McLaughlin, Troy Brown Jr., Shake Milton was obviously started in the regular rotation, but ended up kind of in that 9th, 10th role. Rotating cast of characters that were either generally provided more size or at least played a very specific role defensively in the case of Jordan McLaughlin, who's an on-ball pest, an effective point of attack defender. And now you just have a different makeup. And DiVincenzo, as we talked about at the time of the trade, is a good defender. But in my opinion, he's much better as an off-ball defender than he is as a primary on-ball defender. I think he's passable as an on-ball defender, but the Wolves have a bunch of guys who are passable as on-ball defenders. And that helps. It's less helpful when they're not playing with Rudy Gobert. If their backline defense, if their paint defense is subpar, which it is when it's Naz Reid and or Julius Randle on the floor and not Rudy Gobert, then you need better than just okay point of attack defense. And so, while he is right about if DiVincenzo starts shooting threes better, the perimeter depth will be, vindicated that, yes, this trade did this for the Timberwolves. To me, it only underscores the issues that they have in lack of size and lack of true point of attack defense with their bench unit. Okay. Now let's look at the lineups, and I could, that'll allow me to be a bit more specific about this. So I mentioned this on Tuesday's show, but last season, the Timberwolves without Rudy Gobert on the floor. Okay. So no Rudy, no defensive player on the floor, no defensive player of the year on the floor. The Timberwolves played over 2,500 possessions. They had an 86th percentile defense league-wide with no Rudy on the floor. They gave up just 111.3 points per 100 possessions, which is very, very, very good. 86th percentile. Okay. This season, without Rudy Gobert on the floor, it's only about 400 possessions. Obviously, because we're only 15 games into the season, 14 games into the season. The Timberwolves are a 9th percentile defense with Rudy Gobert not on the floor. 122 points per 100 possessions. Opponent effective field goal percentage is over 56%. Last year it was under 53%. Defensive rebound rate without Rudy on the floor. Or let me say it this way. Cleveland Glass has it as opponent offensive rebound rate. 33.5%, which is 8 points higher than what it was. 6 points higher than last year. Really, really bad. So what's the biggest difference? Well, last year without Rudy on the floor, their most used defensive lineup was Anthony Edwards, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Kyle Anderson, Naz Reid, and Karl-Anthony Towns. That lineup itself was actually not very good. It was, in fact, similar to this year's most used non-Rudy lineup in terms of defensive production or lack thereof. Their most effective / most frequently used lineup without Rudy last year, though, had Jordan McLaughlin at point guard, plus Alexander Walker, Kyle Anderson, Naz Reid, and Karl-Anthony Towns. This season, their most used lineup without Rudy is Anthony Edwards, Dante DiVincenzo, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Julius Randle, and Naz Reid. So, what's the common thread here? Well, Ant, Alexander-Walker, and Naz were in both of those lineups. But, as I've said, they replaced Cat and they replaced Slow-Mo with Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo. Now, that means Anthony Edwards is primarily guarding, Anthony Edwards is kind of the de facto point guard on offense. But for the most part, that means Alexander Walker in both of these lineups is guarding the point of attack. Although, in last year's most successful lineup without Rudy on the floor, Jordan McLaughlin was on the floor. And undoubtedly, Jordan McLaughlin, it probably depended on the opponent. Because if it was more of a true point guard who's a bit smaller, McLaughlin may just be guarding that point of attack anyway. If it's a bigger scoring guard, it's probably either Ant or Alexander Walker that would be on the ball. McLaughlin would then be, if the Wolves are switching, which they, did a lot of, then he would be at the point of attack as well. So the common threads are, well, first of all, last year with Cat on the floor, that meant Naz didn't have to be the true center. But this year with no Cat and with Julius Randle, Naz is that last line of defense. And that's just not who Naz is. It's not who Karl-Anthony Towns is either, but he learned to be somewhat effective in that role. And that allowed Naz to be more of a fearsome, weak side shot blocker. That's not a role that, Naz has really gotten to play this year because he hasn't played a whole lot alongside Rudy. He's played more often alongside Julius Randle. Or at least and obviously we're talking about the non-Rudy lineups anyway. But if you look at Naz Reid's overall block rate, it's way down so far this year. I mean, 3 years ago, Naz Reid had a block rate of 5.5%. This season, it's 1.5%. Guys aren't afraid to go to the basket against Naz Reid. They're not afraid Naz Reid's going to block their shot. But I think it goes back to equally as much. You take Kyle Anderson out of these lineups. Kyle Anderson was the 3 in these lineups next to Naz and Cat last year. Now it's Randle, Reid, And it's either Alexander Walker at the 3 or it's McDaniels at the 3. These lineups have just gotten smaller. And one of the advantages the Wolves had, one of the major advantages last year, was just how massive they were, and yet still switchable. Because every one of these lineups, except for Jordan McLaughlin lineup, you could basically guard 1 through 5. And like you wouldn't actually switch 1 through 5, but you're talking about big guys that can move laterally. And now, like, their most used non-Rudy lineup has Nickeil Alexander-Walker playing the 3. And that's not ideal. And DiVincenzo and Ant are your backcourt. Like, you don't have as much size there. And you layer in, instead of Naz and Cat, you only have Naz. And Julius Randle hasn't been very good defensively. So, and also, by the way, Randle and Edwards, their issues defensively are both of them are so much more off the ball than they are on the ball. They're inattentive off the ball at times. They really just kind of stop paying attention off the ball. And it feels like they each get beat at least once a game on back cuts. And if you don't have Rudy to try and help clean it up, like Naz isn't going to clean that up for you. At least he hasn't so far this year. So it's just the combinations and no Kyle Anderson. And it all links back to this, trying to fix perimeter depth by acquiring DiVincenzo, but not having Kyle Anderson. And when the Wolves first in the offseason, when the summer shook out, pre Julius Randle, Karl-Anthony Towns trade, I thought Joe Ingles was going to step into the slow-mo role. And I know they're not the same player, but I thought at least having that size and savvy defensively could help. Now, it appears as though Joe Ingles may have lost more than a half step since last year. That may be the case. And maybe the Wolves, maybe more so than the Wolves even thought. But this is also an area where, like, Josh Minot's not going to bring the savvy or the know-how that a Kyle Anderson or a Joe Ingles would defensively at this point, but he would bring the size and the activity level and obviously superior athleticism. So this is another situation where, like, hey, having a Josh Minot on the floor with the second unit, playing some of those minutes instead of, spell Ant for a few more minutes a game. He's not helping you much defensively right now anyway. Clearly, the top 3 non-Rudy lineups all have Anthony Edwards in them. In fact, 4 of the top 5, 8 of the top 10, 8 of the top 9 non-Rudy lineups in terms of usage have Ant in them. And they're not good defensively. There's a couple of these in 15, 20 possessions that are giving up 160 points, 170 points per 100 possessions. Why not give Ant a few more minutes of rest here and there when Rudy's off the floor anyway? Put DiVincenzo and Alexander Walker, or DiVincenzo. You probably need Alexander Walker out there instead of McDaniels just from an offensive standpoint. But try Josh Minot in some of those roles to give you that size, the do stuff ability that you're losing with these smaller lineups and the lack of rim protection. Josh Minot, you want some weak side shot blocking ability, some weak side rim protection. Josh Minot's your guy. I really think that is a potential. I don't know that it's a true solve or solution right now, but it's a step in that direction. If the Wolves want to consider tweaking that bench rotation to give themselves more size and more rim protection, because going from 86th percentile in non-Rudy minutes to 9th percentile non-Rudy minutes defensively is a massive dive. Rudy Gobert plays what? He's playing 33 minutes a game right now. Yeah, 33 minutes a game. So that's 15 minutes a game that you're putting a 6th percentile defense out there. That's not going to get it done over the course of a season. If I were Chris Finch, I'd be finding a way to get Josh Minot on the floor a bit more often, steal some rest for Ant or for Alexander Walker or something here in order to try and solve for some of those defensive deficiencies at this stage in the season. I'd rather do it now than try and figure it out in March, right? If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but you still got some time to continue to shift things. All right, let's talk about the Wolves-Raptors matchup. We'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Chime. We've all hit a point at some point before where we've realized that it's time to make some serious money moves. You can take control of your finances by using a Chime checking account with features like no maintenance fees, fee-free overdraft up to $200. You're getting paid up to 2 days early with direct deposit. You can learn more at chime.com/NBA. We've all either overdrafted or somebody who's overdrafted. It happens. And if you do, sometimes it's not even your fault entirely, and you still got to deal with fees. And that doesn't seem fair. But guess what? Chime allows you to overdraft up to $200 with no fees. It's awesome. You can also get spotted on debit card purchases and cash withdrawals. They have no monthly fees or maintenance fees, and there's over 50,000 fee-free ATMs. You can join millions of Chime members who are working on financial progress. It's super easy to use. Just set up a direct deposit in your Chime account. After a qualifying direct deposit of more than $200, Chime will notify you to enroll in Spot Me. With an activated debit card, Chime will spot you up to $200 when you exceed your balance. Your next direct deposit is applied to your negative balance, and Chime never charges fees or interest for using Spot Me. Make your fall finances a little greener by working towards your financial goals with Chime. Open your account in 2 minutes at chime.com/NBA. That's chime.com/NBA. Chime feels like progress. Banking services and debit card provided by the Bancorp Bank N.A. or Stride Bank N.A. Members FDIC. Spot Me eligibility requirements and overdraft limits apply. Boosts are available to eligible Chime members enrolled in Spot Me and are subject to monthly limits. Terms and conditions apply. Go to chime.com/disclosures for details. All right, let's talk Wolves-Raptors. So the Timberwolves play the Raptors in their third game of the season, back at home that Saturday of the opening week. And that was the game. I think it the road trip, LA, the Kings, they obviously had beaten Sacramento the game before that, but Rudy didn't have a great start to the season. And this was the game that I thought Rudy Gobert really controlled from start to finish. And remember, the Wolves got off to a hot start, led by 14 after the first quarter. This was the home opener as well. But then middle of the game, struggled a bit, and the Raptors actually made things somewhat interesting at the end. The Wolves ended up only winning by 11. There was no garbage time in this game. It was a bit dicier than it should have been. Rudy had 15 and 12 plus 4 blocks. He was a plus 20 in this game. And Rudy really controlled the paint. Minnesota ended up, Toronto did win points in the paint in this game, but if I remember right, it was never technically garbage time. It was like the end of the fourth quarter. Things got a bit loose in terms of Toronto just kind of scoring a few points in the paint in what was kind of pseudo garbage time. But at least in the first half, as the Wolves built this lead, it was all about Rudy kind of dictating proceedings on that end of the floor. The Wolves did force 20 Toronto turnovers. Minnesota scored 27 points off those 20 Toronto turnovers. And offensively, the Wolves got what they wanted. They got to the line 26 times. Toronto only shot 13 free throws. And I mean, the Raptors, look, they're just not good. Now, I should say that RJ Barrett did not play in this game. RJ Barrett did play in the Raptors' last game. They beat the Pacers by 11 points. And Toronto is now just 3-12, and they had just lost 7 straight. But RJ Barrett dropped 39 points on 21 shots, did not play in the first game between these two teams. Jakob Poeltl last time out against the Pacers had 30 and 15. Now, of course, the Pacers have a lack of big man depth with all their injuries. And so that was a major factor in this one, I'm sure. But still, RJ Barrett and Jakob Poeltl are quite the duo. And in the first game between these two teams, Grady Dick had 25 points on 16 shots. He's having a decent season so far. Obviously, should note Scotty Barnes got hurt. I think it was the game after they played the Wolves the first time, maybe 2 games after, and hasn't played. Should be coming back soon, but it should not is likely, or he's not going to play against the Wolves on Thursday. Emmanuel quickly got hurt earlier this week. He's out. So this is not a Raptors team. They've had some bad injury luck, to be clear. And Bruce Brown hasn't played, I don't think, all season. So injury issues, but RJ Barrett's back. Jakob Poeltl always seems to play well against the Wolves. And I don't know. I mean, it's these teams that can be talented offensively, that are high variance teams that can give the Wolves trouble. For instance, I mean, one of the keys to this game is clearly offensive rebounding. The Wolves can struggle at times with their defensive rebounding. We didn't see it as much in the first game. Let's see. The Raptors had 12 offensive rebounds, I guess, against the Wolves in the first game, which is more than you'd like to give up. Overall, the Wolves were a -5 on the glass and gave up the 12 offensive rebounds to the Raptors. 3 were Scotty Barnes, and 3 were by Jakob Poeltl. No Scotty Barnes in this game, but with Jakob Poeltl among others. Let's see who else. Jakob Poeltl's the big one. Bruno Fernando is hurt as well. Jonathan Mogbo would be the other guy who's going to grab offensive rebounds for this team, but they're number 1 in the NBA in offensive rebound rate. And they're not a good shooting team. They're actually dead last in 3-point attempts and 3-point attempt rate, and they're 22nd in percentage. So they're not going to take threes, and when they take them, they're not going to make them, and they turn the ball over. So the only way they're really going to beat you by scoring is second chance opportunities and a volume of shot opportunities. And they've got guys that are volume scorers, like an RJ Barrett, right? Like RJ Barrett is averaging 23 points per game this year, and he's launching 6 threes per game. He might only make 34% of them. Grady Dick shoots 7 threes a game, and he only makes 34% of them. But if you give them so many opportunities and you play this higher variance game, you're going to put yourself in a tough spot. And the Raptors play at a pretty middle of the pack pace. But again, it's the offensive rebounding that's the biggest concern for me. So it's rebound the basketball on the defensive end of the floor. Don't foul. They don't get to the line a ton, but like don't make it easier for them because you're the favorites. You should win this game. Defend without fouling. Don't get your best players into foul trouble, etc. if you're the Wolves. And they should be totally fine in this game. The Raptors are not a good defensive team. They're bottom 5 defensively, no matter what metric you look at. They foul a ton defensively. They don't force turnovers. They don't rebound the basketball. It's a team the Wolves should be able to at least have a shot of getting right against offensively. And we did see some signs of life offensively for the Wolves in these last 2 games. The overtime win over the Kings and the buzzer beater with Randle over the Suns on Sunday. The offense is trending in the right direction. It's some of the stuff we've already talked about defensively and with the bench, the non-Rudy minutes that the Wolves need to, fix. They've got Toronto Thursday night, off Friday and Saturday, and then at Boston for a matinee on Sunday, and then finally a longer homestand, 4 games next week. But difficult matchups. Houston, Sacramento, and both LA teams come to Target Center the week of Thanksgiving and into the following week. So I'll be back tomorrow on Friday for a post-game pod following Wolves-Raptors on Thursday night. And I believe should be a live postcast following Wolves-Raptors as well. So make sure to tune into that on Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube. And then that audio will be right here at Locked On Wolves, wherever you listen to podcasts. Otherwise, that's all I've got for you here today on the show. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. A reminder that there's now a Locked On Wolves newsletter. One stop for Ultimate Team and League coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free right now at LockedOnDaily.com. That's LockedOnDaily.com. Start your day with the all-new free Locked On Wolves newsletter. The Locked On Wolves podcast is, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.